BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the show. As you saw from the beginning, this had the Black Box Online Radio introduction. This episode is actually a simulcast that is coming out on both BBOR and Astro Psych 400, because I thought it was connected to the material for both channels, and I'm going to be responding to the documentary Psychiatry and Industry of Death. Did you guys know that there is a Scientology channel out there? I did not know that until about 2 months ago. For about 5 weeks, I was staying in a place that had DirecTV, and for the first time in a long time, I ended up watching just regular television. And I found that there was a Scientology channel, and they were advertising a documentary called Psychiatry and Industry of Death, which came out several years ago. At first I thought that it had come out in 2014 because that was one of the date stamps on it, but then after Googling it, it says that it actually came out in 2006, so it is an older documentary. But they were airing it on the Scientology channel, and I thought I would give it a watch. However, I forgot. And just recently I did a Google search, and it's online for free in a couple of different places. And this is a very interesting subject because a lot of what we know as Scientology comes from a single person, L. Ron Hubbard. And back when I was reading up on him in the past, there are a couple stories about his life that he was struggled with mental illness. In one source, it said that he had bipolar disorder. And when I was just looking him up prior to this episode, it said that he suffered a psychotic episode. And I don't mean to diagnose anyone or actually go off of anyone's particular findings, because there's a lot of ambiguity in that. But when I did an episode of Black Box Online Radio about L. Ron Hubbard in the past, the info that I shared in that one is that he dealt with mental illness at a time in his life, and he was involuntarily committed on 2 different occasions. And following these experiences, he developed a very nasty view of psychiatry, and he began to think that it was something that was absolutely not good for humanity, detrimental to humanity might be a better way of putting it. And then the consequence of that later on was that you had Tom Cruise, the actor and Scientologist, going on television in the early part of the new millennium, telling people not to take psychotropic drugs because he knows the history of psychiatry and the doctors do not, or at the very least the television reporters do not. But in this documentary, Psychiatry and Industry of Death, it is a persuasive piece as opposed to simply a descriptive one. It is taking a very strong stance that's saying that there are lots of flaws in the psychiatric system of medicine. Like the actual concept of psychiatry is one that is heavily exploited by numerous medical professionals. And not only is it exploited, but there are very, very enormous ways in which it can be exploited in an unexamined way. Like the system is set up so that people can take advantage of it, and the whole thing is rigged. Now, some of the things that they talked about in this documentary I didn't feel were extremely persuasive, because I don't only want to talk about the things that I might agree with, I also want to talk about the things that I would disagree with, and that would be bringing up examples from the 1800s about abusive methods that were used on patients. Like, one of them was putting somebody in a box that is more or less a coffin and then submerging the coffin underwater, and talking about how that is very abusive to a person. And I was like, well, yeah, but the thing that they're leaving out is that people do not do those things anymore legally, at least not in the United States of America under our current laws, because they were inhumane. So people learned that these things should not happen, and they put laws in place to prevent these types of abusive measures from taking place. And of course, stuff like that isn't mentioned in the documentary if you ever want to see it for free. And I definitely want this to be available to people who have not watched it, and just to weigh in on your own personal experiences. But I also found that this documentary, Psychiatry and Industry of Death, seemed to have a very odd understanding of the subject, because they talked about how psychiatrists are supposed to be helping people, but a lot of them end up doing things that are very abusive toward their patients. And I have never heard this part from anyone. This is my own analysis, my own response, my own genuine take on the subject, and I've said it a couple of times on Black Box Online Radio, but psychiatry isn't so much about well-being. Psychotherapy is not even so much about well-being. Psychiatry is about dominance and submission. Psychotherapy is about surrender. It's about getting someone to surrender control of their emotional faculties over to somebody else. And the reason why is because there really is not just a simple go-to cure-all for everybody. Believe me, I've tried. Like, when you just want to Google something about, like, how do you fix all the problems in your life, there doesn't seem to be a solution that is easily available. So what my understanding of this is that things associated with well-being you have to do on your own, and it's not a satisfying answer. In fact, it really sucks. But then what's the point of psychiatry or something like that? It's about observing someone's behavior and putting someone in a place where they cannot do physical harm to themselves or other people, mostly other people, but that is like the primary concern. And then, of course, committing physical acts of violence toward themselves. That's it. That's it. Anything associated with well-being is out of the question. That is not the focus and intention of psychiatric treatments. Now, maybe if someone is seeing a counselor, psychologist, therapist, maybe they might be actually a little bit more focused on something about trying to stabilize somebody's moods in somewhat of a compassionate way, but not necessarily, because that one is about surrender. And the first point is that ideas, emotions, and behaviors are not objects, and I absolutely don't like it when anybody refers to them as something that is a physical object, like, oh, the emotional wound is getting to the surface. No, it isn't. It's not an emotional wound. It is something that is like a memory, a behavior, it is an experience, emotional trauma, absolutely, and it has to be dealt with in a different way. And it is my understanding that a therapist is someone who is trying to allow someone to surrender control of their emotional faculties to them, so that they will, again, try to alleviate any type of distress that is causing someone to be prone to destructive behavior. So this whole concept of, well, I mean, there is no well-being going on in the psychiatric industry. Of course not. It's not supposed to. And a lot of the documentary, Psychiatry and Industry of Death, was really focusing on antidepressants and how pharmaceutical companies make lots of money, how psychiatrists make lots of money. And I really felt that the examples that they were providing were not all-encompassing. For example, they talk about how a psychiatrist might spend 10 minutes with some patients, or some patients might even be just a handshake, and they would just say, hi, I'm going to be your doctor, and then they walk away, and then they can see all the patients within 30 minutes, but for each person they interacted with, they bill 1 hour, and then it looks like they have billed an enormous amount of hours to the insurance companies, and I absolutely don't dispute any of that. I'm sure that those are real examples because, firstly, it makes sense. Secondly, for-profit medicine exists in the United States of America. All of that seems to be real, but is that the be-all, end-all of psychiatry? I don't think so, but this was definitely presented like it is, and I don't think that that is exactly a fair statement. Now, Jordan Peterson, of all people, the psychologist and YouTuber, had a very strong stance on medications and these whole things about the pharmaceutical industry is for profit and who should actually go on medications. I mean, like, are people overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed? What Peterson's take on the subject is antidepressants are for people who have their life in order. They're for the people who have their relationships sorted out. They have employment, or maybe they're a student and they have those pieces of their life in place. And yet they are still experiencing some type of depression or other condition. And then when it comes to taking antidepressants, you will know if it works or not in a month. And I thought that that was a very fair assessment because he's not saying that they are completely bad, and he's also not gung-ho for antidepressants saying, oh, medication is the only way to solve the problem. Now, my guess, and I repeat, a guess, is that L. Ron Hubbard perhaps experienced a lot of issues associated with will breaking in the psychiatric world. And that, again, if someone is going to try to just do this dominance and submission angle, which I definitely do believe exists, then people were probably trying to control him mentally. They were perhaps probably using manipulative, intimidating, and coercive measures. And if it's all about dominance and submission, well, people are going to try to dominate him and they want him to submit to them. And he probably had a very bad experience with that. And perhaps it was debilitating, embarrassing, humiliating, and maybe extremely traumatic. Like, somebody even posted a meme on Facebook saying, why am I never honest with my therapist? Because they will hospitalize me, meaning that they want to improve their life, they want well-being, but if they are going to be hospitalized, they believe that they will experience humiliation and an additional form of emotional trauma. They'll be traumatized in a different way. And again, I don't think that those things are out of line. I mean, that stuff definitely does seem like it is real if someone is only focused on dominance and submission. But as far as how patients in hospitals become victims, I was listening to an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, perhaps one of the only episodes of Joe Rogan that I have ever heard in its entirety because it featured the guest Tom ONeill, and he was promoting his book Chaos, and he talked about how it was very normal for people to do experiments on mental patients because their behavior could always be explained. Even if somebody had a very adverse reaction to an experiment, they could always just blame it on the person's pre-existing mental condition. Again, I also think that that is bad and that those patients are exploited. But for somebody like L. Ron Hubbard or Tom Cruise or this documentary Psychiatry, an Industry of Death, to act like that is something that is bad in psychiatry. Of course it is, because they again fail to understand that is abusing the system, not using the system to its fullest extent in the correct and appropriate way. So if they want to highlight and examine wrongdoings that are done in the world of psychiatry, I think that's a good thing. And this documentary did a very good job at showing lots of the problems, but I think they ignored a lot of contradictory evidence, or even if they aren't ignoring it, they aren't taking it into account in their presentation, that a lot of these things are just simply wrongdoings committed by people. Say, for example, I mean, if someone is a fast food worker or a bus driver or an anesthesiologist and they do something bad, that is just somebody doing something bad. It doesn't mean that about the entire fast food industry or bus drivers union or anesthesiologists association of doctors, whatever it would be. It doesn't represent the whole. So that is also a little bit misleading. And a big challenge that is dealt with in the world of psychiatry is that it blends hard science principles with soft science principles. For example, like, you have to ask people questions, and based on their responses, knowing which course of action to take, and sometimes it can even be down to something that is going to be chemical, like which medication does this person receive based on observations of their behavior. But human beings are imperfect, and human beings are going to make mistakes from time to time, and there are many people featured in this documentary, Psychiatry and Industry of Death, talking about how they had absolutely terrible reactions and adverse reactions to the medications that they were prescribed. And I mean, again, I don't doubt any of that. I think that all of that is true. But there are some people that have benefited from medication. In 2020, I was listening to the I Survived podcast a lot. It's a show on A&E, but I would get the podcast version off of Podcast One. And one woman was talking about how she was experiencing a lot of depression after she had been attacked by someone. And as I said, it's called I Survived. So she survived a very, very brutal attack. And then when she started taking antidepressants, there was no immediate change, and she thought it was an absolute joke. But after 6 weeks, she noticed that she had stopped crying less and that her mood had improved, and she had a beneficial reaction to taking antidepressants, and she was advocating for them. But again, I don't. I think that Peterson's assessment of this might actually have some merit, because I remember when I was listening to the channel Oak Leaves and Onions, the host of that one, she is an anonymous host, but she talked about how she was depressed since the age of 8. And I think I can relate to that one. While I do not have a very strong experience in the medical world, I'm not a medical doctor or anything, I can definitely know what it's like to have bad experiences as a kid and as a preteen and as a teenager, being depressed since the age of 8. And when I look back on my life, I mean, I just wanted to ask this person, were you actually depressed, or were you just dissatisfied with your living conditions? Because that's that whole statement. For someone, if someone has their life in order and they're still experiencing these types of depressive feelings, then perhaps medication, antidepressants, would be something to turn to. Whereas if someone does not have their life in order, they aren't good at holding down friendships, they aren't good at standing up for themselves, they aren't good at interacting in social circles, maybe the answer isn't medication, maybe it's something else. And even it might not even be something that anyone can teach them. It might just have to be their own self-awareness and intrapersonal learnings. I said intrapersonal as opposed to interpersonal. I mean, perhaps. That's the thing, though. You can't just put your life story into Google and get an answer about what to do. A couple of years ago, I was watching an episode of Law and Order SVU, and there was a guy on there who was a musician who was advocating for the end of psychiatry, talking about how psychiatric practices are very abusive. He was someone who had experienced electroshock and talked about how it was very traumatic for him. And he was actually on the stand because it's Law and Order. He's in the courtroom and he's being cross-examined, and the attorney says that, well, did you attempt suicide before you had any of these treatments? And he said yes. And then she says, after you had all of these experiences, did you ever try to kill yourself again? And he said no. And then she said, well, then maybe psychiatric medicine didn't ruin your life. Maybe it saved it. And that is one of the most ridiculous things that I have ever heard, because it sounded like, I mean, do we not teach children two wrongs don't make a right? And that episode was advocating for two wrongs do make a right. And that goes back to that point at the beginning about how someone doesn't want to be humiliated or traumatized in a different way. I mean, that doctor, whoever, this fictional doctor that this guy was seeing on Law and Order SVU, may have corrected one issue in his life, but then created a new problem that wasn't there before. So all of that could have been avoided, and absolutely, two wrongs don't make a right, and I think that that is something that psychiatry and industry of death was really trying to promote and advocate, is that there are a lot of abusive practices that are going on, and they are not examined. There is no punishment for them, and in fact, the system encourages it because it is very profitable for everyone. And that is the heart and soul of their claim, but it's not the entire thesis. Their thesis of this documentary that I was watching says that psychiatry is bad and that it is inhumane, and I don't think it was very convincing. But I'd be very curious what everybody has to say in the comments section if you've ever had any first-hand mental health experiences. I really have not had too much of an experience with it because I saw a psychologist 3 times when I was a teenager, and I went to the campus therapist. Was it 3 or a handful of times when I was in college, and that's it. That is it. I've had lots of conversations with people who work in the mental health industries and like various aspects of it, whether it's someone who actually is a psychologist or someone's a crisis worker. But again, that's not like a session. I mean, I'm just talking to someone about their findings. And I also did an episode of Black Box Online Radio called The Neuroscience of Serial Killers, where I had the opportunity to ask a bunch of questions to a neuroscientist. But again, that's not as a patient. Those are just about me trying to learn about these things. And as I said, I had a very limited experience to this subject because I was not impressed by the way that by the way that the sessions were being conducted, those handful of times that I did go. And in an older episode of Black Box Online Radio, I shared some of that because the documentary Psychiatry and Industry of Death says that the term mental illness is overused. And I was really discussing this very heavily in a previous episode because I absolutely agree with that. I do. And I think the reason why it's overused is because it has a different meaning to people in the psychiatric world. And it's, again, my own observation. I know that it's not going to be very well accepted, but with psychologists and psychiatrists, they attribute their own meanings to certain words. Like a mental illness does not mean that someone has a type of chemical imbalance. What is a mental illness? Well, that means that someone is exhibiting a certain set of behaviors, and if this person meets the criteria and all the points on that checklist, or sometimes it's 6 out of 10 points on the checklist, then they would have the mental illness. Whereas the term mentally ill, that is something completely different. And that just means destructive behavior. If somebody is mentally ill, they are either committing destructive actions or they have the very high likelihood of committing destructive actions. And I was talking about it in the past because I received a magazine, like an alumni magazine from the university that I went to, and there was this poster that was in it that you could unfold, and it talked about how if you have even 1 or 2 signs of of like on their list of imperfect qualities, then maybe you are mentally ill and you need to talk to a counselor. But they were just so general. They talked about things like feeling down or feeling sad. I have anxiety at some point throughout the day. Very, very basic stuff. And they said even 1 or 2 of those things. Well, yeah, I guess I did feel sad yesterday. So, I mean, that means that you are going to experience something where you are mentally ill. No, I think that that is exactly what Psychiatry and Industry of Death was talking about. So certain things are blown out of proportion or misrepresented, or the general public is simply not aware that people are using terms in certain ways. Like I say, for example, if someone is mentally ill, that doesn't mean that they are exhibiting certain types of behaviors and they actually have any type of diagnosis that is in the DSM. No, that means that they are either committing destructive actions or they have a high likelihood of committing destructive actions, or maybe it's even some type of destructive behavior that is brought on to themselves internally, like they're unaware of their mental faculties, but that's all basically the same reason. Again, if you would like to dispute any of this with me in the comment section, or what I think is more valuable is if people can just weigh in their own take on the subject. What do you think about this? Do you think that people are over medicated, or do you think that people aren't going far enough? Because I was discussing this with somebody about, let's see, it's probably been 13 or 14 years ago, and this one person said over and over again, I just wish people wouldn't try and throw pills at everyone and act like that's the solution. Pills referring to medications, psychotropic drugs. And the response that I heard from someone later on, just again watching a documentary, was that someone said, everybody's complaining that people are pushing pills on their patients. Well, what is the alternative? If a doctor does anything else, they're going to get sued. This is something that they're doing out of liability, and it's also the only method that they can actually use to make sure that somebody is going to try and, again, improve their mental health. But by improve their mental health, again, in the psychiatric sense, would mean just controlling the person and dominating them so that they are in a state where they cannot bring physical harm to themselves or other people, or they're not actively going to. I mean, of course, you always have the capability. The majority of people have the capability to do so, but to remove whatever would make someone choose to do that. And as I said, I didn't really have very beneficial experiences with those fields, because I just had to sort of make the assessment that I'm going to be responsible for my own well-being. Yeah, it feels good to talk to somebody sometimes, but other times it does not. And there really isn't a personality that is going to be some type of magical cure-all that can alleviate everything. And having conversations with people is also not a magical cure-all. But I'm reminded of something that was shared on the channel Bulldog Mindset by John Sonmez when he said, you have to be your own rock. And by that he means you have to be your own support system. You're the person who is going to be there for you. And you got people like Dr. Phil saying, be your own best friend. But I think that he even crosses certain lines sometimes ethically, where he makes his ideas sound sillier than they actually are. But I really had a big reversal on Dr. Phil once somebody informed me that he actually has the biggest self-help show in the world. Actually, it might have been on an episode of Free Domain Radio. Free Domain Radio was hosted by Stefan Molyneux, who was a very controversial YouTuber who got deplatformed because he blended in a bunch of very undesirable set of subjects with the self-help things that he actually talked about. But as I was watching this documentary, Psychiatry and Industry of Death, I was thinking so much about how I miss a lot of the things that he did share on his show, and I've never once listened to him after he got deplatformed. Deplatforming people actually works. However, it came to the point where I was just thinking that he talks to people about their mental health issues and their relationships and their parents and so on. But it wasn't even so much his take on the subject as observing other people and how they try and manipulate, because how do people do inappropriate things and then try to justify their inappropriate behavior? How do they continue to do their inappropriate behavior? If they have a very big problem in their life, how are they trying to avoid it and then blame other people for their actions? And that stuff is absolutely enthralling, because Howard Stern, of all people, said the most fascinating subject in the world is dissecting the everyday, ordinary individual and trying to figure out how he or she thinks. But on Free Domain Radio, I heard something that, it's some food for thought, that medication isn't always the answer, because now with the internet, we have such a greater access to self-help, and a lot of the people that are featured in Psychiatry and Industry of Death are experiencing some very serious mental health issues, but maybe they were diagnosed inappropriately, or they were given medication that wasn't helpful to their body, and it actually had some very adverse reactions. And some people perhaps could have their problems solved with self-help techniques. Again, it's not perfect either, but it would have less devastating consequences if there were indeed a mistake. Psychiatry and Industry of Death also talked about the concept of involuntary commitment, committing someone involuntarily. And they talked about how psychiatry is the only medical discipline that can turn people into prisoners. However, I think that there are other examples where doctors can take people into medical custody if they believe that someone is in danger in some ways. I remember watching that on a show once where someone needed surgery and they were completely incapacitated, but the parents didn't want the surgery, and the doctor says, "I'm going to take her into medical custody." That was from a fictitious TV show, but that's just the first thing that I thought of. Now, this again is really where psychiatry does indeed blend in a lot of hard science and soft science practices and values and thinking. But as I also think Psychiatry and Industry of Death made a certain conflation when they looked at how there is the concept of involuntary commitment, and then there's the concept of medical treatment. Like, someone could be involuntarily committed against their will, but I don't know if they actually have to take medication at that point. Maybe some people are forced to take medication against their will, but I mean, this is really something that I'm not familiar with. It was always my understanding that people are given the medication voluntarily, and when you watch this on television, the doctor will check their tongue to make sure that they have swallowed it and ingested it. But I don't know if that's the best example, but again, there are lots of loopholes and cop-outs, and the system is designed to protect those who have the power. So, I think that in conclusion, they really highlighted some very valuable wrongdoings that are committed in the psychiatric industry, but they definitely ignore certain benefits that do happen. Like, some people do have good experiences with taking medication, and some people perhaps do have improvements in their own well-being. And I absolutely do not agree that the destructive and inappropriate and inhumane methods of the past justify the actions of our present. Like, as I said, submerging somebody in a coffin underwater as a medical treatment. Those things were bad, and that's why we recognize them as bad, and that's why they aren't done anymore. And once people often become aware that there are certain wrongdoings committed in all types of industries, in all types of aspects of life, then we put an end to that. And that definitely is not only associated with psychiatry. I'm sure that all of those things actually happen, and there are lots of abusive methods. But what we do is we try to improve the system, not simply blaming a certain system for the way that it functions. And acting like that is the root cause of all the problems. Oh, it's all a sham, it's all for profit, it's all done by abusive people who are trying to destroy humanity because they can get away with it and they can earn money in the process. No, this documentary did not convince me of that at all. Instead, it did pay attention to some very big mistakes that are committed, and places where the general public often turns a blind eye to because they don't want to deal with the very, very saddening aspect of the subject. Well, what do you think about psychiatry? And I would love to read your responses down below, and I'd also invite you to listen to some of the other episodes on Black Box Online Radio and Astro Psych 400, especially some of the older episodes from BBOR that I was referencing in this one where I talk about medical terminology, and then there's also the one on L. Ron Hubbard. I also did at least one episode on Sigmund Freud, but it was more about the interpretation of dreams, and it's only very loosely connected to Freud in that sense. I was actually talking about real dream interpretation, which would be some good stuff for Astro Psych 400. Anybody can write Black Box Online Radio at just that, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. If you heard this episode on Astro Psych 400, that's the best email to get me at. And of course, Facebook, Black Box Online Radio. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I'm on Facebook as well. The BBOR listeners can get all this in the description box. And of course, there is always BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram, and I will see you over there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.